Marhaba, shalom and welcome to the exciting podcast Israel and Palestine Unpacked that is dedicated to exploring the complexities of the ongoing political situation between Palestinians and Israelis. Throughout this podcast, we will explore unresolved issues, the human cost, and the diverse experiences and perspectives of those directly affected. These discussions demand sensitivity, as the emotional weight of the topic cannot be overlooked. So far, we have focused primarily on the personal stories of individuals, their experiences, struggles and views, which provide valuable insights into how lived experiences shape perceptions. Moving forward, in the near future, I aim to engage with academics, historians, journalists and writers who have examined different dimensions of this complex political landscape. Additionally, we will highlight the significant contributions of peace organisations, both locally and globally, whose work fosters understanding and offers paths towards reconciliation. This podcast approaches the subject from an academic perspective, striving to unpack and better understand the issues at hand. I am not a journalist by trade, and my interviewing skills are continually developing. With each conversation, I aim to grow through self-awareness and constructive feedback. While I may occasionally miss opportunities to further explore claims or subjects, I view these moments as steps in a learning journey that I hope will make each episode more insightful. Finally, it is important to emphasize that all views expressed are those of the interviewees alone, and do not necessarily reflect the views of this podcast. Coming up in today's episode, we meet Jonny Clark. Jonny is the Programme Manager for Public Theology within the Corrymeela Community, Ireland's oldest peace centre. Corrymeela was founded in 1965 by Ray Davey and a group of university students. Based in a town called Ballycastle, on the north coast of Northern Ireland, it is a place that provides for dialogue, healing and community building, particularly in the context of sectarian divisions. Today, Corrymeela continues its work, addressing contemporary issues such as migration, trauma and identity, striving to create a more peaceful and inclusive society. I would like to extend special thanks to Jonny McCullough for taking the time and effort to edit these interviews during this particularly busy period in my life. I hope you find this episode of Israel and Palestine Unpacked both informative and deeply moving. If you'd like to receive more content like this, feel free to subscribe and join us as we continue exploring insightful perspectives on this complex and deeply human conflict. Jonny has worked in peacebuilding and reconciliation for 25 years, both in Belfast and in post-conflict contexts around the world. His work has focused on fostering dialogue, understanding and healing in divided communities. In 2018, he produced a documentary titled Guardians of the Flame, along with an accompanying podcast of the same name. The film explores the experiences of 3 individuals who were directly impacted by Northern Ireland's conflict, highlighting their personal journeys, struggles and hopes for peace. Through this project, Jonny aimed to shed light on the power of reconciliation and the resilience of those affected by violence. In this interview, we speak with Jonny about his involvement in Corrymeela. We explore the role of faith as a tool for conflict resolution and how it can serve as a positive social force to improve the lives of Israelis and Palestinians while fostering inclusive societies. However, before delving into these topics, we begin by discussing what public theology is.
Public theology is what faith has got to do with Monday to Saturday. What's it got to do with beyond church on a Sunday morning? What's it got to do with the life hereafter, heaven or hell, or these kind of big questions that many Christians think a lot about. It's more to do with what's it got to do with poverty, what's it got to do with war, what's it got to do with climate change, what has our theology got to do with the very public issues that deal with us day to day, 24/7. And I suppose a very valid critique of a lot of religious kind of work is that it focuses on pie in the sky when we die, and it does. What's it got to do with the real issues that we face today? And of course, the most profound public Christians of the last, 1,000 years have been people who have engaged on public issues. So when Martin Luther King is walking over a bridge in Selma, Alabama, he's challenging racial segregation, but he's using his Bible and he's using his faith at every step of the way. He's not putting that to one side and saying, no, I'm going to get involved in the dirty issues of kind of politics. And likewise here in Northern Ireland, we've been victims of religious bigotry. We've been confronted with leaders who have used the Bible to divide, to enhance sectarianism. But we've also been a society that was deeply nourished by the beauty of what religion can offer. So I made a documentary in 2018 called Guardians of the Flame, and it's from this quote from the former First Rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, who said, religion is like fire, and like fire, it warms, but it also burns, and we are the guardians of the flame. And so I think public theology, at best, is kind of creating a beautiful, warming flame of love and compassion, but also projecting a strong voice for justice in a world of great inequality and injustice.
So you just to kind of build on that, you are involved in Corrymeela.
Uh-huh.
Okay, what exactly is your role in Corrymeela?
Yeah, so my role in Corrymeela is technically it's public theology. So for those of you who don't know, Corrymeela is Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation centre. It was set up in the mid-60s, just before the Troubles, by a Presbyterian chaplain at Queen's, Ray Davey, who had seen the horror of the Second World War, not only of what was done by the Nazis, but he had been in a prisoner of war camp in Dresden and observed the horrific Allied bombing of Dresden, where many women and children were just innocently destroyed in balls of burning fire and bombs that rained down on Dresden. And as he watched that scene, he was struck by the capacity of humanity to inflict evil on each other. And so he dreamed that one day maybe he could be part of starting a peace center. And of course, that dream was realized 20 years later in 1965 in an act of preemptive reconciliation, you could say, because he created a space for encounter before the Troubles here really broke out. And so Corrymeela, I suppose you could say it was set up as an act of public theology. What would it look like for Christians to live together? What would it be like for us to create a safe place beyond the sectarian divisions? And so that's what Corrymeela was set up as. And my role when I joined 3 years ago was to be kind of create spaces for theological engagement around public issues. But also, I think you could say wider than just the public theology. It's what public voice does Corrymeela have on issues like legacy, the legacy of the Troubles, the legacy of the past. What voice do we have on issues going on around the world? And how do we articulate that? So there's lots of stuff I could throw in terms of what I do. A lot of what I do, I suppose, just to add on, is creating networks. I'm really honored to be part of gathering interfaith families together for meals regularly and for residential weekends. I run a monthly event called Borderlands, and we gather people in the intersection of faith and belief and art and community and justice and reconciliation. And I also have a kind of an online network of emerging peace builders around the world who are gathering to in an online space to kind of learn how to be peacemakers in this world. And I'm part of kind of convening that, I suppose, and resourcing them and helping disseminate more of this message of peace that was in Corrymeela was started in 1965.
Yeah, it's interesting because like I'm 44 now, and I remember, I'm just trying to think back now. I generally don't try not to count back in years, when I think of the decades that have passed. But I think when I was about 12, our school and another school, so for people listening outside, a Catholic school and a Protestant school. Spent a bit of time at Corrymeela up on the north coast. It was a good experience. We did a lot of team building activities together in order to try and attempt to break down the divides
Hmm.
that were very prevalent and much more expressive at that particular time of our lives in the early 90s, I think it was. Somebody's
Hmm.
going to do the maths, when they're listening to this. But, I understand that the idea of integration, peace, and reconciliation are very much a core components of Corrymeela and bringing people together from different faith backgrounds. So you yourself also have an experience out in Israel and Palestine. Does your role in Corrymeela play any particular part in regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? How do you integrate, or even how do you integrate that within your own particular personal life at present?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is that it's not explicit. It's not a massive part of my current role. I've been kind of involved in Israel and Palestine physically since I first went there in 2003. Um, I could go back to studying the situation in my GCSEs in the early 90s and reading apocalyptic, terrible theology books on it when I was a child. I shouldn't laugh because they really are tragic. Some of those kind of fairy tale theology books that really contributed to a lot of the injustice we see now. But um, so yeah, I've had a deep interest in it for decades. My work at Corrymeela is primarily focused here in Northern Ireland, as well as the kind of online emerging peace builders work, which we hope will increasingly include young people from Palestine and Israel. But for right now, it doesn't. So Corrymeela isn't trying necessarily to kind of interpose itself, or is that, if that's the right word, into that situation. We're trying to do our work and trying to create a safe place for dialogue and engagement on the north coast of Ireland. And I mean, I think that was one of the things, even during the Troubles here, in terms of our own conflict. Corrymeela wasn't necessarily always trying to articulate a perfect position on every issue. They were just trying to create a safe place for people to have dialogue. And that's, I suppose, where Corrymeela is. Where I am is I feel deeply passionate about the Israeli-Palestinian uh, situation. I have many friends there that I love very much. And I feel like it's an important duty for myself to speak out about it. I just go back to my first visit in 2003. It was during the time when the separation wall was being built. And I was part of a group of people, and it was a fascinating visit. And we were taken around by different groups. I think one of the groups, I think it was Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and they were showing us places where Palestinian houses were getting destroyed by Israeli authorities, and this wall was dividing communities. And we saw Palestinian women struggling to climb over this new wall that was being built so they could get to shops or hospitals or whatever, and realizing that once it was completely built, they would be cut off from so much, from family members. And so, I was really struck by that. And one particular day we went to a village, and we saw how the wall, the root of the wall, was going to be cutting the village off from its land, the land which it used to farm. And so it literally would, overnight, its a whole livelihood would be taken away from them. And I remember one of the farmers came up to our group, and he said, "You people come here from overseas, and you come and you look and you take your pictures and you go home and you forget about us." And I personally heard him, and I didn't hear him as being wildly angry. I just saw a passionate man desperate for help. And I kind of felt there was a sense of the finger of God pointing at me saying, "What are you going to do, Jonny? What are you going to do when you go home? Are you going to forget about this guy? Are you going to forget about this situation?" And so that particular moment has stuck with me for 20 years, and it's kind of really informed my continual advocacy for peace, for justice uh, in the wider Middle East, and particularly in Palestine, in places like Gaza and the West Bank.
So how would you talk to people, for example, who are skeptical of the involvement of faith in resolution of conflict? For example, when I think of both past and present of the use of, for example, from Islamic extremists of suicide bombers, that Israel built the wall in response to try and prevent and to bring a sense of safety in Israeli society,
Mm.
but also of Jewish extremism, which is raising its head much more confidently in the Palestinian territories, attacking Palestinian villages, but also to use the example of the man who the Palestinian farmer who's standing there and saying, you foreigners come and you take your pictures and then you go home. And in many ways, people from outside have played a very negative role. You think of the Crusades historically, but also think of various ideologically driven Christians.
Mm.
So, how can faith, for example, in your opinion, be utilized to not only challenge those narratives, but also to present and to build upon public theology, the use of faith positively to better the lives of Palestinians and Israelis in society?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, I guess, a key question in lots of places of conflict because religion has been part of the narrative of so many conflicts. Here in Northern Ireland, you could say, oh, it wasn't a religious conflict, it was an ethnic conflict. Well, that's true in one way, but there's no doubt that religion was being used to just to further divide people at times. It was part of the problem, as it has certainly been in Israel and Palestine, as it certainly, if you look at the Lebanese civil war, lots of issues involved there. The proxy war, superpowers, global regional powers all fighting, but taking advantage of ethnic and religious divisions in Lebanon. So religion's always used, well, not always, almost always used in conflict. So there's a legitimate question that you're asking. If religion is part of the problem, why are we, talking anymore about it? Can we just kind of get rid of that? And I suppose that's fair enough in one way. I suppose what I would say is that some of the great heroes of social change and even peace and reconciliation in the world have been people who were motivated by religion. I already talked about Martin Luther King. We could talk about other emancipators and people. We could talk here in Northern Ireland just to kind of use our own conflict. Father Alec Reid from Clonard Monastery and his at the time someone who worked with him, Father Jerry Reynolds, who I knew very well. They were profound priests motivated by their faith, living on the Falls Road, overlooking the Peace Wall on Cooper Way, overlooking the Shankill. They were motivated by their faith to open their monastery to whatever they could to facilitate peace in the 80s and the 90s. And ultimately, Father Alec created the space for John Hume, Jerry Adams to have talks. Those talks paved the way for our peace agreement. And so for that reason, Clonard has been referred to as the cradle of the peace talks. And I think, in some ways, without their involvement, we wouldn't have had the same peace. So I think religious leaders, religious people, Desmond Tutu, whatever, these people can make significant differences in their societies. I suppose the reality is when Jesus was looking at first century Palestine, first century Galilee, first century Jerusalem, he was looking at a part of the world and he goes, look, this part of the world needs a bit more religion. He wasn't really saying that. What he was saying was this part of the world needs people who will learn to love their enemies. And this part of the world needs a new movement of people who will transcend the Jewish Gentile boxes. And so his ministry was perpetually reaching out to people beyond religious boxes. So I think when religion is something that is just about enforcing sectarian divisions, then it's part of the problem. It's no good. But when religion is part of helping people transcend sectarian divides, then it's something very beautiful. And I would say it's on the path of Jesus. The Gospels open with an account of him nearly getting thrown off a cliff in Nazareth after reading a passage from a scroll in Isaiah. And in that passage, he stops just before the passage refers to God's vengeance on enemies. He doesn't read that bit. That kind of obviously got the crowd a bit annoyed. And as he came out, they start kind of whispering among themselves. And he mentions two of their greatest prophets, Elijah and Elisha. And he says, in their days, Elijah and Elisha were sent not just to their own people, their own tribe, the Jewish people, the Israelite people. They were sent to a widow in Zarephath and a Syrian general who was like literally the leader of the enemy army. And at that point, the crowd tried to throw him off a cliff. Why? At the start of Jesus' ministry, he was saying his ministry wasn't just about enforcing sectarian divides and us and them, and I have come for my people. He was saying, God has always been in this for everyone. He's always been reaching out beyond divides and beyond little boxes. So I think religion can be part of the solution if it's done well, if it's about transcending boxes and enabling the pulling down of sectarian divides. When religion's used just to kind of try to get people to convert to a kind of a bunch of beliefs that get them into heaven when they die, what good is that? When religion's used just to kind of cement your side and to diminish the other side, then what good is that? So I like the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think you can call that religion if you like, or you can just call it profound revolutionary thinking.
Okay. And so something there you said that I found was really interesting. You talked about how religion can be used in a way to well, you didn't use the word dehumanize, but to put people down, to put one side above on a pedestal over another, or vice versa. Are there examples within the Israeli-Palestinian situation where religion has been used as a positive social force, or not just religion, but the idea of faith, even outside of the Christian community, within Judaism and within Islam?
Yeah. I mean, in my involvement over the years, I have met a number of Muslims, of Jewish people, of Christians who are just beautiful people, beautiful Israelis, beautiful Palestinians, beautiful people of faith, and motivated by their faith, seeking to bridge divides. Some of them are activists, because justice is part. I think sometimes we think justice is separate from reconciliation, but actually activism and justice, advocating for justice is part of reconciliation. So it's not always the feel-good stuff, but it's significant. And so I've met people who in organizations like the Parent Circle, which is bereaved families from both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, and many of them didn't have much faith, but many of them did. I've met people in the West Bank deeply motivated by their Christian faith. The organization Musalaha was an organization I encountered, again, 20 years ago. And I know very well people like Salim Minayer, who set it up, and Lisa Loden and different ones, both Israeli Jewish and Palestinian Christian. So yeah, I've met and encountered many, and there is something beautiful about it when you see people of their own faith, whatever it is, living lives that build bridges. Yeah.
So just a final question. Part of your work is focused very much on healing process within society. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say it. Yeah.
Okay. So, like, for example, we're both living in Northern Ireland. We both live in Belfast, and Northern Ireland is an example of a place that has experienced multi-generational trauma.
Mm.
In so many ways, like historically with the Irish context, and more specifically within Northern Ireland, as well as Palestine and Israel, there is also a history of being re-traumatized time and time again. Now, we are much further on in our healing process here on the island of Ireland than Israelis and Palestinians are. And you've mentioned, and even from my own life, I've experienced a lot of wonderful people, both with faith and without faith, who transcend the sectarian identities that are part and parcel of everyday life. In your opinion, how can public theology help to build inclusive societies? Is there something that the Israeli-Palestinian context can learn from Northern Ireland without directly comparing them and saying that they're both the same?
Yeah, I'm sure that we can learn stuff from lots of conflicts. I'm sure Israelis, Palestinians can learn from our conflict. Absolutely. There's a lot of similarities. You only have to drive around the city of Belfast and see all the plethora of Palestinian and Israeli flags marking out different neighborhoods, Palestinian flags in Republican areas and Israeli flags in loyalist areas. And even that itself should help us kind of realize there's a resonance between our two conflicts. And in reality, between most conflicts, I was in South Africa in 95, and it's such a different conflict to us. But there were so many themes that I thought, gosh, this is very similar: dehumanization, demonization, the use of religion, supremacy of one people over another. Yeah, so I think there's so much similarity, so there's a lot we can learn. I think healing is a word you use, and I think it's a good word. I think the big deal that most post-conflict societies or societies in conflict have to deal with is, well, how do we deal with the past? How do we the past will always come back, Rwanda, Bosnia, recent examples of societies that had suffered trauma 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and it was revisited in the 90s. It came back again. And so there's a need for us to heal the past somehow, or else it will keep recurring. And of course, there's no magic pill to that. If they could just figure out, there's endless masters and PhDs on how you can learn how to heal. But I would just say we have to do the work somehow. We have to do whatever we can to try. Over here, public theology can look like, for me, working on a project to see a national day of reconciliation, and we're standing on the shoulders of the likes of the brilliant organization Healing Through Remembering, and also Wave Trauma, who for nearly 20 years have been advocating for a national day of reflection, where on the 21st of June, we as a society would be able to come together and all acknowledge that many of us have suffered, and that many of us were colluding in the suffering that was present. So there's a universality about our suffering, and on one day of the year we remember it. Because without that day, anniversaries become very divisive things. On the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, one part of the community remembers it. On the anniversary of the Enniskillen bombing, for instance, another community remembers theirs, and so we remember separately. And so in post-conflict societies, it's actually helpful to have kind of rituals of remembering that bring us together. And we, as Northern Ireland, we don't have that. We could never agree on that. And so part of my work has been, what would it be like to really build on some momentum on this day of reflection? And so I've been involved for the last 3 years in cathedral services on the 21st of June. So the 21st of June was chosen because it's the longest day of the year. It's a day of light. Originally, Healing Through Remembering, the organization that started the initiative, they wanted to find a calendar day in the year when no one died. And they couldn't find a single calendar day where no one had died during the Northern Irish conflict, the conflict in and about Northern Ireland. Every single calendar day was the anniversary of the death of somebody in our conflict. And so therefore they thought, well, there's no day we can pick. Let's pick the day of light, the day of most light, a day of hope. And so the 21st of June was chosen. And that kind of initiative has been going for a number of years, and it probably hasn't completely taken off. And so part of my role is, what would it be look like to create a service of lament on that day? Lament is a very biblical practice, and it's part of what healing is about. It's not denying that the past happened. Let's be happy and move on. It's let's remember, let's grieve, let's lament, but then let's move on with hope for the future. So hope and lament are actually connected. And that's public theology. And I think I would say Israel and Palestine, if they were to learn from us, and learn from that particular initiative, it could be holding national days to lament the past, things like the Nakba, things like suicide bombings. I don't know, like we can't just brush things under the bed and hope they go away. They won't go away. It becomes there's a sense of the past being an open wound that is just perpetually festering and kind of infected and oozing poison until it's cleaned out, dealt with, and healed. The healing is complicated, though. I'm going on a bit far, but I'll just say one thing. I suppose as a Christian, I think the motif of healing is an important part of what our faith should be about. I think I grew up in a kind of largely Protestant background. I mean, my parents were New Zealanders. We were Kiwis, imports into Northern Ireland. So we were in the 80s, and so we were a bit different. But I was in a largely Protestant environment and very religious. I went to church at least once a week, if not twice or 3 or 4 times. And I often heard the gospel being summarized as Jesus taking away my sins. So instead of being judged by God, I've been released by Jesus. And a lot of Bible verses were used, particularly from the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul describes almost this courtroom scene. And it's almost like kind of God is the judge, angry judge wanting to sentence us. The devil's the prosecution, and Jesus is our wonderful defense attorney who kind of gets us off. And so for many Protestants, the gospel is about us having a legal problem. We're guilty and we need a lawyer. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, as you may be aware, there's a much stronger sense that we can understand the gospel as about we are sick and we need a doctor. There's something in us that is broken and ill, and we need help. And when I look at our society, I don't think we need a lawyer. I think we need doctors. We need healers. To use the words of Henry Nouwen, we need wounded healers, people who have the scars of living in this world, but have been transfigured by beauty and by grace and by forgiveness, and can take that message out into the world. And I think that's a beautiful message. And so I think the healing idea is what the cross is about. It's about what the gospel is about. And it's what I would say my faith as a Christian is about. If I am a follower of Jesus, I should be about healing. And that for me is what public theology should be about. It's what our theology looks like when we go public with it. It's about how do we articulate a message in a society of anger and sectarianism and outrage? How do we articulate a message that heals and builds bridges and brings people together?
Yeah, even just to end on that, I recently read the book A Paragon, probably butchered the pronunciation, written by Colin McCann
Yes, yeah.
of Bassam and Rami, and how with Rami losing his daughter in a suicide attack and Bassam losing his daughter in the refugee camp close to Jerusalem, the soldier shot her dead. Both are examples from different faith backgrounds who have embraced that process of the wounded healer or the wounded person who is desires to forgive and to live out that process of forgiveness on a daily basis, and they're quite an inspiration to me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. It's a beautiful book, and their stories are profound. I first met Rami Al-Hanan. I've met him a number of times now. I've met him the first time in 2003, and I, at the time, thought, I'm not sure I've ever met such a kind-looking man whose eyes just were so kind. And yet he was telling the story about the brutal suicide bombing of his gorgeous teenage daughter, Smadar. And yeah, and he didn't tell the story with a simple little, and then I forgave. In fact, he seemed to kind of in some ways bypass the word forgiveness, because it can sometimes be seen as you're absolving those who did it, or you're letting them get off scot-free. Instead, he just talked about his desire to try to understand, why would people want to do this? Why would they hate me so much? And I think that empathy piece is what's usually missing in most conflict areas, is that people simply don't understand the other side. They just don't understand the other side. It's what we find here in Northern Ireland. It's what you can find in Palestine, Israel. There's just a very profound unawareness of what the other side is feeling. Just to use, I hope he doesn't mind me using this example as public. A friend of mine, Palestinian, brilliant man, Sami Awad, went to Auschwitz concentration camp and spent a night sleeping in one of those huts. And for him, it was an attempt to try to understand what it was like for a Jewish person to have been there during the Second World War, but also what would it be like for a Jewish person today to remember what happened in Auschwitz. And for him, as a Palestinian who had grown up witnessing so much injustice towards his people, he was trying to seek to understand, not just to be understood, in the words of the prayer of St. Francis. And I think that kind of thing is what the world needs. It needs lots of stuff, but that degree of empathy and a desire to learn what the other is feeling and thinking and is very profound and very important.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want to express my deepest gratitude to our guest Jonny for their openness and willingness to share their personal views, experiences and rich stories. Looking ahead to our next episode, we'll be speaking with Professor Mohammed Dajani Daoudi, founder of the Wasatiyya movement, a distinguished academic and advocate for reconciliation. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Your engagement means the world to us. If you have thoughts, feedback or questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out via email at israelpalestineunpacked@gmail.com or connect with us through our Facebook page. All the contact details are included in the description below. Finally, don't forget to follow or subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss future episodes. I hope you'll join me next time on Israel and Palestine Unpacked.